Think about a witch hunt for a second. The old-fashioned kind of Salem witch trial witch hunts. The witches burned at the stake or drowned or killed in other unspeakable ways kind of witch hunt. We often assume that they happened because of an outgrowth of religious fervor or a superstition. Something's going on and you can't explain it, and so you blame someone, and that someone, of course, is women. Now that's part of it, but there may be more to it. What if, instead of superstition, those early witch hunts were political? Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. Welcome back. We are starting a brand new book this week. This is Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. This book is unbelievable. This is one of the great works of feminism. This is making the argument primarily that modern capitalism rests on the subjugated bodies of women. And a little peek behind the curtain, I read this book a couple of years ago. I put it on the list because I really like it and because it is such a towering work. And then as I fairly recently came back to this book, rereading, doing the notes and doing the scripts for these videos, I started to get really, really excited because this book is phenomenal. I can't say how excited I am to get into this book specifically. It is amazing. Now, if you are new to this channel, my name is Justin. We talk about great works of leftist literature on this channel, and you can check out the Patreon. That's patreon.com/champagneanarchism. All of these books are up there. All the main feed stuff is absolutely free. You can go and get extra content, things like the new series that I'm running there, the 100 Great Anarchist Thinkers series. We're into our proto-anarchists. I just put up a video about Jesus Christ. Can Jesus's early thought be considered a proto-anarchist thinking? Maybe, maybe not. Check out that video. And if you are already a subscriber to the Patreon, thank you so much for being here. Your support, it means the world to me, and it helps me make all of this main feed stuff because I think that information about things like Caliban and the Witch should be freely available to anybody who wants it. So you really help make that main feed available to anybody, and I genuinely appreciate it. Thank you so much for being there. As always, please like, subscribe, tell your friends, reach out to me directly. I'm always happy to take those. I really appreciate when people engage with stuff like this. So thank you so much. And let's get into it. Now, before we do get into it, I have a bit of a necessary disclaimer. This is a work of feminism, and I am not a woman. That means that there are experiences that I don't have. When it comes to a text like this, there are things that I kind of won't necessarily get, especially when we talk about the subjugation of the female body. There may be things that I miss. There may be things that I don't fully understand. I am trying to approach this as I write this series with a degree of humility, but if you see something that I have missed or that I haven't properly understood, call me out. I don't mind at all. And that will help me make this series better. And of course, you can be of any gender to engage with a work like Caliban and the Witch. So that's just my necessary prologue to all of this. Now, the roadmap for this video. We're going to go through this in 6 sections. We're not going to get too much into the actual material of the book. This is just a video to give you sort of the prerequisites, the ideas that you need to have in the back of your mind, the kind of baseline knowledge that will help you truly engage with this book. So we're going to talk about Silvia Federici herself, a little bit about her biography. Then we're going to go into Karl Marx and the theory of primitive accumulation, which he actually steals from Adam Smith, but either way. The third section is Michel Foucault and biopower. This is the French philosopher Foucault. Will get into his ideas of biopower and how they apply to Caliban and the Witch. Moving on from there, we're going to talk about the central metaphor for this book. So Shakespeare's The Tempest. Who was Caliban, and what does it mean to have this Caliban metaphor embedded, not even embedded, in the title of this book? The fifth thing is feminism. We're going to talk about what exactly feminism is for Federici. It's very nuanced. And then we will talk through some of the criticisms for this book. And we'll obviously extend all of this across. This is 7 videos in total that I'm going to put up on Caliban and the Witch. So there's going to be a lot more of this. We're just sort of laying foundation here. Silvia Federici was born in Parma, in Italy, in 1942, and that time and that area of the world means that she was born in a part of the world that was still reeling from fascism and war. She moved to the United States in the 1960s to pursue a PhD at the University of Buffalo, and that put her squarely in the perfect spot to witness the explosion in the US of feminism, the anti-war struggles, the civil rights movement that was kicking off. She had a front row seat to all that, but she didn't just study the politics of the time. She took part in it directly. And quite famously, in the 1970s, Silvia Federici threw herself into the movement by becoming one of the founding members of Wages for Housework. The Wages for Housework campaign in the 1970s made the argument that housework isn't women's work, it is unpaid labor that props up the entire capitalist system. And you can sort of see the roots for what will eventually become Caliban and the Witch in that very argument. From the 1970s onward, Federici had a mostly academic career. She teaches kind of all around the world, including a few years in Nigeria that she found profoundly influential. She started to look at things during this period like the structural adjustment policies pushed by the IMF and the World Bank, and started to look at these global inequalities that are fueled by the system that we all take part in. We've talked about a lot of this before on this channel, but Federici finds this very, very interesting, and this feeds into a lot of her work. And when we talk about the modern applications of something like Caliban and the Witch, this is very, very important. Federici likes to talk a lot about the restoration of the commons. And so this idea of structural adjustment policy, pushing neoliberalism, all of this feeds into that idea. This book, Caliban and the Witch, was published in 2004. My dog is rustling around back there. It's okay to pay more attention to him than it is to me because he's much cuter, but what are you doing, Apito? Anyway, Caliban and the Witch is published in 2004, and it is by far her most influential and famous book. There are other books that are worth checking out if you have the time and space, and I have a reading list and a to-watch list. You can find that on the Patreon channel as well, just background stuff that could be helpful as you go in to read this. But Revolution at Point Zero, it combines a lot of her academic research. It is much, much tougher to read. I have not read the whole thing in its entirety, but I have read sections, and it's very, very interesting. It's a nice fundamental basis for a lot of this, but still more challenging. And you can also check out Witches, Witch Hunting, and Women, which is a collection that updates Caliban a little bit. And we'll get into that further on in this series. But that is Silvia Federici. At time of recording in 2025, she's still working. She's at Hofstra University. But let's leave Federici's biography and talk about her thought. Or actually, let's talk about Karl Marx's thought. Hello to Karl Marx. And then we'll talk about her thought. So, Marx and primitive accumulation. What is primitive accumulation? And I should say, if you want the proper foundation for all of this, I went back and marked up this section. This is Volume 1, Part 8, the so-called primitive accumulation. That's in Capital, Volume 1, as I said. You can go back to Marx. Let me get this over there. You can go back to Marx and read a little bit about this. I would never force anybody to read Marx. I will give you the bare bones of this idea. But if you want something more in-depth, do feel free to go back and refer to Marx, because Federici is going to be directly addressing this idea. The thing about Federici is that she is working alongside and against Karl Marx at every point in this book. But what is primitive accumulation? Well, primitive accumulation is an idea that Marx takes from Adam Smith, whose gigantic book, The Wealth of Nations, I also have on that shelf back there, but I didn't put it on my desk because I have too many giant books on my desk right now. Anyway, Marx takes this idea from Adam Smith. Let's say that you want to build capitalism from scratch. How would you go about doing that? Well, capitalism, or the capitalist mode of production, is a system in which capital oppresses and extracts value from labor. So, in order to create capitalism from scratch, you must create the capitalist class. How do you do that? To do that, you have to shift enough capital into the hands of the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, to kickstart this process. And there are many different forms of capital, but how would you go about doing that? Well, there are three primary ways. The first way is enclosure. Now, enclosure happens across Europe, and in England, it is actually formally legalized in enclosure acts. Enclosure is when land that has been held in common between different people, things like forests or pastures, farmland that has been commonly used by a community, is fenced in and privatized. The second way, especially to create a capitalist underclass, is what we call vagrancy laws. These are laws that criminalize poverty. Marx calls them bloody legislation against the expropriated. We talk a lot on this channel about enforced precarity, which is you take a job because you can't afford not to take that job. If you don't have a job, you lose your insurance, you lose your house, you fall into unpayable debt. Whatever it is, vagrancy and poor laws were one of the earliest ways that Europe had of criminalizing poverty and enforcing that precarity that we talk about. The third way you can do this is literally just to steal the capital, so conquest and slavery. We talked a lot about this when we talked about Eduardo Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America. That is a very important book. We did that 2 books ago. Fantastic book, and Caliban and the Witch ties in really nicely with that. But if you need capital, you could just go out and take it. That's sort of the idea. So either enslave the people and take their labor, or literally rip resources out of the ground and send it back to Europe. Or, as Marx says, capital comes dripping from head to foot, from every pore, with blood and dirt. So, conquer and steal. Easy. If you've done these things right, congratulations, you have created the working class, i.e. people who must work to survive. So where does this leave Federici? Well, Federici agrees with this analysis on a basic level, but she says that Marx is only half right here. Yes, capitalism was created through a potent mix of violence and theft, but it's more than that. Because the thing that made all of this possible was Europe's war against women, and there are 2 parts to this. The first part is literal female labor. So she talks at several points in this book about the wages that women earned going to the men. Men also depended on the unpaid labor that was done by women, the housework, the cooking, the childcare. But there's a second dimension to this, because women's literal bodies needed to be disciplined beyond just the work. And that is because women produce workers. And there is so much behind this, and we will get into all of this, but just a couple examples that occurred to me as I was writing this script. Federici talks, for example, about the forms of contraception switching from a sort of herbal forms that were under the control of the women themselves to male forms of contraception. And you can think about that now, right? We control abortion pills so much more tightly than we control condoms. Federici also talks about how traditional roles like midwifery became male-dominated in the 16th century of Europe. And then, of course, the hundreds of thousands of women who were tortured or executed during the witch hunts. But we will get to that. The other major philosopher that Silvia Federici engages with in this book is the French philosopher Michel Foucault. Foucault is a bit of a foundational philosopher when it comes to theories of things like incarceration or madness or otherness in general. But there's this really powerful idea that he developed that we call biopower, and it's one that Federici refers to directly in this book. So what is biopower? Well, let's say you're a queen who wants to rule over her subjects. You can chain them up, you can send them to the hangman, you can kill people, but there's a type of power that's actually beyond that. That sort of traditional power is what Foucault calls sovereign power, right? The power that says, I can take your life. But what if you want power beyond just the ability to destroy? What if you want power, in other words, to regulate, to optimize, to control life itself? Well, that's biopower. There are roughly 2 forms of biopower. There's biopower over the individual, and then there's the biopolitics of the population. We won't deal too much with this distinction, just know that there is this distinction, but together they create a system where the sovereign or the state or whoever is in control has an extraordinary degree of control over the literal bodies of the people living in a given territory. Biopower tracks bodies. It intervenes in health. It gets to decide who in a society gets to flourish and who is left behind. That is the essence of biopower. So laws on the books that tell people they can or can't get an abortion, that's biopower. Legislation that say that teens can't access trans healthcare, that's biopower. Everything from a minute sort of BMI chart to mass sterilization program, those involve some form of biopower or biopolitics. And also some of the things that we consider generally good or offensive, things like vaccine mandates, things like sex ed classes, even wellness culture, that also comes from a form of biopower. The thing that Foucault says about this type of power, which is something that we on this channel talk about in reference to many different types of power, is that this power actually flows from us, and that makes it all the more pernicious. We internalize the rules of this game, and that means the state doesn't actually have to be tyrannical because we discipline ourselves. So if you go back to the example of the queen trying to exert power, all of a sudden the queen doesn't need soldiers. The queen now needs schools or social workers or some nonsense AI program that's gonna run our health system. But now let's bring this back to Federici, because Federici doesn't disagree with anything that Foucault is saying here, but she sharpens his critique in some important ways. Federici in this book points out that biopower and the distribution of this type of power is incredibly gendered, which is something that Foucault doesn't really mention. And moreover, what Federici says in this book is that the state's power over women's bodies, over sexuality, over reproduction, it's not just an application of biopower. It's actually the application of biopower that is completely central to the development of modern capitalism. Everything that we live in and through these days is underpinned by this specific application of biopower. And I should say this just to get this out there. She also says, listen, Foucault does not go far enough back in time at all. So she adds so much more to this analysis by going back to the 16th and 17th centuries and adding in a bunch of examples from those historical periods. But that's just in general. Now let's move on to some of the more metaphorical stuff here. And that means we've got to talk about the other gigantic book on my desk, and that is Shakespeare. Now, that's my giant collection of Shakespeare's plays, and Federici actually refers to a couple Shakespeare plays in this book. She makes direct reference to The Taming of the Shrew, which we'll get into when we hit, I think, chapter 2. But the central metaphor for Caliban and the witch comes from The Tempest. The Tempest is one of Shakespeare's most famous and most confounding plays. I actually just saw it recently on the West End with Sigourney Weaver. Gonna brag about that real quick. Anyway, we've actually discussed The Tempest before on this channel because we talked about The Wretched of the Earth. And one of Frantz Fanon's intellectual idols, this man Césaire, wrote A Tempest, which is a direct response to the Caliban metaphor in Shakespeare's The Tempest. But who is Caliban? And what was The Tempest? Well, broad strokes here, there are three characters that really matter in The Tempest. There is Prospero, and Prospero is a powerful sorcerer who has shipwrecked on this island. And on this island, Prospero controls two individuals. One of them is Ariel, who is his magical servant. He works for him. And then there's Caliban. Caliban, we are told, was the only inhabitant of the island until Prospero showed up. He is the son of a powerful witch who we never meet in the play, but anyway, and he lived on the island freely and wildly until he was enslaved by Prospero. Prospero's battle to tame Caliban can be seen as kind of the conflict between high spirituality and reason, that's Ariel, that's embodied by the character of Ariel, and the sort of animalistic or primitive urges, which are embodied by Caliban. But for thinkers and writers who came after, particularly people like the decolonial thinkers like Césaire and the feminist thinkers like Silvia Federici, see Caliban as a symbol of the oppressed, the dispossessed, or the colonized, the possessors of some type of magical power. Also, Federici will talk about this idea of magic much later in this book, and we will get into this idea. I almost wanted to break this out into a separate section talking about the magical body versus the mechanical body, but we'll come to this in a lot more detail when we talk about this. So let's just talk about this in the context of Shakespeare here, because in any case, for Federici, Caliban is the symbol of the oppressed body under capitalism. And I don't know if you need to read The Tempest to understand Caliban and the Witch, but I actually think it is worth reading around, or at least looking for some of the lines of this work to just get a deeper sense for the symbolic argument that Federici is making in this book. Or at least listen to this part of Caliban's lament. And this is where he talks about the illusions and the call and the beauty of his island. And he wants to, in this section, escape sort of this waking life by falling back into the beautiful dream that's brought about by the voices on his island. And he says, "Be not afeard, this isle is full of noises, sounds and sweet airs that give delight and hurt not. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about mine ears, and sometimes voices that, if I then had waked after long sleep, will make me sleep again. And then in dreaming, the clouds methought would open and show riches ready to drop upon me, that when I waked, I cried to dream again." I have so many problems with this play, but I absolutely love Shakespeare. Anyway, let's move on from The Tempest and from the Shakespeare metaphor, and let's talk about feminism. Obviously, Caliban and the Witch is a deeply feminist work. It is one of the most important modern works of feminism. However, Federici has been very clear that for her, feminism is contextual. What does that mean? Well, Federici contextualizes the feminist struggle in the broader struggle of the oppressed. There is a fascinating and very short interview that on that main document on the Patreon, you can go and you can listen to Federici sort of lay out her case for a feminism that transcends the word's more political uses. She is deeply against the, what you might call, sanitized sort of UNification of feminism. That's the sort of feminism that seeks emancipation through labor and through access to capital. A feminism that seeks to just more deeply integrate women into the capitalist machinery, that's not a true feminism for Silvia Federici. And as you read Caliban and the Witch, just keep in mind that Federici's feminism is a deeply revolutionary type of feminism. And with that, let's move to some criticisms, because you'll always get criticisms with any book as big as Caliban and the Witch. We will talk more about these as we go through this series, but I wanted to start off the bat with kind of two major ones, just to sort of put this in the back of your mind as you read Caliban and the Witch. The first is about Federici's historical perspectives, and the second is about her treatment of gender. The first thing, when we talk about history, Federici is not a historian. So you will see a few people online complaining about her not giving a proper historical account. If I'm honest, I don't tend to take these complaints fairly seriously. It's pretty clear to me that this is an interdisciplinary work. There's a bunch of different things. Federici is not trying to give us a historical account of this period. What she's doing is presenting an argument, a deeply Marxist argument, and then she's raising historical examples to support that argument. So if you're looking for something that is an exhaustive treatment of women and the subjugation of women through the 16th and 17th centuries, Caliban and the Witch will give you the basis for that, but it won't do more than that. So that's the sort of account of history criticism that you may occasionally see levied against Silvia Federici. The second type of criticism will pop up occasionally from the left, and that's the accusation that Federici's analysis is too binary. That is to say, there's no room in Federici's analysis for the trans body. And that is kind of odd, because Federici's treatment of the body, and we will get so much more into Federici's idea of the body as we go through these videos, but it's incredibly nuanced, her perspective on the body. And that's to say nothing of the way that she portrays this process of historically how human civilization defined gender roles and pushed femininity and masculinity in certain directions to serve the interests of capital. There should be more room in a book like Caliban and the Witch for transness and a discussion of transness and queer theory. Federici's analysis is primarily about the human body. It is most often the biologically female reproductive body. Of course, we know that gender, masculinity, femininity, they are wrapped up in culture and history and norms of all types. And we know that this sort of biological binary distinction is not terribly binary anyway. Federici doesn't really follow any of these threads in this book. There are critics that you will see online, a few blog posts especially, that try to use this and Federici's treatment of the body to brand her as a trans-exclusive radical feminist, something like J.K. Rowling, for example, on Twitter. To my mind, that is utterly ridiculous, and I don't see how anybody could take that from Federici's work and the work like Caliban and the Witch at all. However, that being said, could you build some kind of queer theory into Caliban and the Witch? Absolutely. And people have done that, and hopefully we will get into a little more of that, especially in the third chapter when we talk about the great Caliban, but we will get to that later on. I just wanted to flag this pretty early on that there could be more queer theory in a book like Caliban and the Witch. All of that brings us to the end of this little guide that I've tried to put together here. But I do want to say one more thing, if you'll indulge me here, which is don't read this book like it's a work of history. Federici is very clear about this, and she says in Caliban and in later work that all of this stuff that she's talking about, primitive accumulation, biopower, the witch hunts, all of this is an ongoing process. It's not like it happened in the past and that translated into present events. This is an ongoing process for all of these things. And in later work, she points to and talks about modern day witch hunts, the modern day violence against women that is still about disciplining the female body. And every day we see new and more creative ways to exert biopower over people and over populations. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate you taking the time to kind of come here and engage with these ideas. Let me know what I'm missing, what you think about all of this, just general thoughts, comments, anything you want to know about before you go in to read Caliban and the Witch. Have you read this before? And is there anything other people should know before they go in to read this unbelievable work? Let me know. Drop comments anywhere you like. Check out my social media. I think I have 4 Blue Sky followers, so check out that Blue Sky account. I will start posting more stuff there, hopefully. And also always feel free to drop me a line directly. I am always happy to take those. And just a quick plug once more at the end to check out that Patreon channel, patreon.com/champagneanarchism. I'll be back next week to talk about chapter 1 in this incredible work, and I will see you then. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.